The sun rose over Oakmere like a promise, painting the harbor in shades of gold and coral. Caroline Reed stood on the wooden pier, her weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee. At 67, she had the kind of face that spoke of years spent near the sea. Sun-touched skin, lines that crinkled around her eyes, and silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore faded jeans and a navy sweater, looking like any other resident of this small coastal town. "Morning, Caroline," called out Tom Foster, the harbor master, from his office window. He was a stocky man in his 50s, with a perpetual sunburn and an easy smile. "Morning, Tom," she called back, raising her mug in greeting. "How's the water looking today?" "Calm as glass, perfect for your class this afternoon," Caroline nodded. She taught diving at Seabreeze Diving, the local dive shop that catered mostly to tourists and the occasional resident looking to earn their certification. It was honest work, peaceful work, and it kept her close to the ocean without demanding too much of her heart. The town of Oakmere had been her home for 25 years, though most people who met her assumed she'd lived here her entire life. She had that quality about her, a rootedness, a sense of belonging that made newcomers think she was as permanent a fixture as the old lighthouse on the northern point. The truth was more complicated, but Caroline had learned long ago that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for yourself was to let the past stay buried. "Caroline, wait up." She turned to see Jenny Martinez jogging down the pier, her diving gear bag slung over one shoulder. Jenny was 28, with dark curly hair and an infectious enthusiasm for marine life. She'd been working at Seabreeze for 3 years and had become something like a younger sister to Caroline. "You're early," Caroline observed with a smile. "Couldn't sleep." "I'm too excited about the wreck dive tomorrow." Jenny bounced on her toes. "I've been reading everything I can find about the SS Catherine. Did you know she was carrying medical supplies when she went down? Some people think there might still be intact bottles of vintage morphine in the hold." Caroline's smile tightened just a fraction, but she kept her voice light. "The Catherine's been down there since 1943. I wouldn't get your hopes up about finding anything intact. But we might?" Jenny's eyes sparkled. "And even if we don't, the structure itself is supposed to be amazing. Marcus said the cargo hold is completely accessible, and the engine room has this incredible—" "Jenny," Caroline interrupted gently, "remember what I always tell my students?" The younger woman straightened, reciting dutifully. "Never get tunnel vision underwater. Focus on safety first, exploration second." "Exactly." Caroline squeezed her shoulder. "The Catherine is a beautiful dive, but she's also an 80-year-old wreck. Metal fatigues, structures shift. We go in with respect and caution." I know. Jenny grinned. "You're the most careful diver I've ever met. Sometimes I wonder if you've ever taken a risk in your life." If only you knew, Caroline thought, but she just smiled and changed the subject. "Come on, we have beginning certifications this morning, and I need you to help me check all the rental equipment." They walked back down the pier together, passing the morning fishermen hauling in their catches and the early rising joggers making their way along the coastal path. Oakmere was a town of about 5,000 people, swelling to nearly double that in the summer months when tourists flooded in for the beaches, the diving, and the famous Oakmere Seafood Festival. Caroline loved everything about this place. She loved the whitewashed buildings with their blue shutters, the narrow streets that wound up from the harbor into the hills, the smell of salt and fish and morning coffee that hung in the air. She loved the rhythm of small town life, knowing everyone's name, having her usual table at Martha's Cafe, being invited to every birthday party and graduation and wedding. She'd built a good life here, a simple life, a safe life. The dive shop was located in a converted boathouse right on the waterfront. The sign above the door, painted in cheerful turquoise letters, read, "Sea Breeze Diving, your gateway to the deep." Inside, the walls were covered with photographs of underwater scenes, coral reefs, schools of fish, divers exploring wrecks. Rental equipment hung in neat rows, and the air smelled of neoprene and salt water. Marcus Webb, the owner of Sea Breeze, was already there, sorting through paperwork at the front desk. He was in his mid-50s, tall and lean, with sun-bleached hair and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades staring at the horizon. He'd opened the shop 15 years ago after retiring from commercial diving, and he'd hired Caroline within her first month in Oakmere. "There she is," Marcus said, looking up with a grin. "My most reliable instructor." "Your only instructor who actually shows up on time," Caroline corrected, hanging her jacket on the wall hook. "Also true." Marcus shuffled his papers. "We've got 4 students this morning, 2 couples from Boston who want their open water certification. They seem eager but completely inexperienced. Think you can handle them?" "That's what I do best." Caroline glanced at the schedule board. "And we're still on for the Catherine dive tomorrow?" "Yep. We've got 8 people signed up. Mix of experienced divers and advanced students. It'll be a good group." Marcus paused. "You sure you're okay with it?" "I know you prefer the shallower sites." Caroline had carefully cultivated a reputation for preferring easier, shallower dives. She claimed it was because she liked teaching beginners and didn't need the adrenaline rush of deep diving anymore. The truth was that deep wrecks reminded her too much of things she'd rather forget. But the Catherine was different. She was a popular dive site, only about 80 feet down, with good visibility and relatively easy navigation. Caroline had dove her a dozen times over the years and had always found the experience peaceful. The wreck had settled into the seabed decades ago, becoming more reef than ship, home to fish and corals and the gentle sway of kelp. "I'll be fine," she assured Marcus. "The Catherine's an old friend." The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Caroline met her 4 students, David and Amy, a young couple in their 20s, and Robert and Linda, closer to her own age and celebrating their 40th anniversary with something adventurous. She spent 2 hours in the classroom going over theory, safety procedures, and equipment use. Her teaching style was patient and thorough, never rushing, always making sure everyone understood before moving forward. "The most important thing to remember," she told them, gesturing to a diagram of the human body, "is that diving is all about pressure. As you descend, the pressure increases. As you ascend, it decreases. Your body needs time to adjust to these changes. That's why we never, ever hold our breath underwater, and that's why we always ascend slowly and make safety stops." "What happens if you ascend too fast?" Amy asked nervously. "Decompression sickness, the bends. Nitrogen that's dissolved in your blood forms bubbles, like when you open a shaken soda bottle. It can be very serious." Caroline softened her tone. "But it's also very preventable. Follow the rules, listen to your body, and don't panic. Panic is more dangerous than any equipment failure or marine life you'll encounter." By afternoon, they were in the pool behind the shop, practicing skills in controlled conditions. Caroline demonstrated how to clear a flooded mask, how to recover a regulator, how to achieve neutral buoyancy. She moved through the water with an easy grace that came from thousands of hours underwater, though she never mentioned that to her students. "You're really good at this," Linda said as they surfaced after a drill. "How long have you been diving?" "Long enough," Caroline said with a smile. "Now let's try that regulator recovery again. Remember, don't panic, sweep your arm back, and..." The day ended with all 4 students successfully completing their pool work. They scheduled their open water certification dives for the following week, and Caroline watched them leave, chattering excitedly about their upcoming adventure. She felt the familiar satisfaction of a job well done. Jenny appeared beside her, dripping wet from her own dive. "You're a natural teacher. I don't know how you stay so patient." "Patience comes with age," Caroline said, wringing out her hair. "I hope I'm like you when I'm older." Calm, confident, totally in control. Caroline looked at her young friend and felt a pang of something like grief. Jenny saw her as someone who'd always been this way, steady, predictable, maybe a little boring. She didn't see the woman Caroline had been before Oakmere, the woman who'd commanded teams of engineers, who'd made split-second decisions with lives on the line, who'd pushed the boundaries of what was possible under the sea. That woman was gone. Caroline had killed her 25 years ago, buried her under layers of routine and small-town normalcy. And that was exactly how it needed to be. "Let's clean up," she said, turning away. "I want to get home before dark." Caroline lived in a small cottage on Seashell Lane, about a 10-minute walk from the harbor. It was a tidy white house with blue shutters and a tiny garden where she grew tomatoes and herbs. The interior was simply furnished. Comfortable couch, small kitchen, bedroom with a view of the sea. The only unusual feature was her bookshelf, which was packed with marine engineering texts, oceanography journals, and technical manuals that she couldn't quite bring herself to throw away. She made herself dinner, grilled fish with roasted vegetables, and ate on her back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and orange. This was her favorite time of day, when the world grew quiet and she could simply exist without performing, without maintaining the careful persona she'd constructed. Her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "Just confirmed. 8 divers for Catherine tomorrow. Meet at dock at 9 a.m. Weather looks perfect." Caroline stared at the message for a long moment. The Catherine. Tomorrow. 8 divers depending on her expertise and judgment. She closed her eyes and let herself remember, just for a moment, what it had been like to be Dr. Caroline Reed, submarine engineer. The thrill of solving impossible problems. The pride of seeing her designs work perfectly under conditions that would have destroyed lesser vessels. The camaraderie of her team, especially Sarah, her brilliant colleague and closest friend. And then the accident, the emergency call, the desperate hours trying to coordinate a rescue that came too late. 7 people dead, including Sarah. 7 lives ended because a system Caroline had helped design had failed catastrophically. She'd reviewed the data 1,000 times afterward. The accident hadn't been her fault. A manufacturing defect in a hydraulic coupling, something no one could have predicted. But that knowledge didn't help. She'd been the senior engineer on the project. She should have caught it. She should have tested more thoroughly. She should have. The guilt had been crushing. She'd had a nervous breakdown, spent 6 months barely functional, and finally made the decision to walk away from everything. She'd chosen Oakmere almost at random, a small town far from any major submarine research facility, far from anyone who might recognize her name. For 25 years, she'd kept her head down. She'd been Caroline the dive instructor, not Dr. Reed the engineer. She'd deliberately chosen simple dives, basic teaching, nothing that would require her to tap into her deeper knowledge. She'd built walls around her past and hadn't let anyone get close enough to ask questions. Caroline opened her eyes and looked out at the darkening sea. Tomorrow, she'd take 8 people down to explore an old wreck. It would be fine. It was always fine. She knew how to keep people safe in controlled conditions, and the Catherine dive was about as controlled as they came. Nothing was going to go wrong. The morning of the dive dawned clear and bright, with barely a ripple on the water. Caroline arrived at the dock early, as always, and began her pre-dive checks. The boat they'd be using was the Sea Breeze Runner, a sturdy 35-foot dive boat with space for 12 people. Marcus was already aboard, checking the engines and navigation systems. "Beautiful day for it," he called out. "I think we're going to have perfect visibility down there." Caroline nodded, moving methodically through her checklist. She examined each tank, tested every regulator, double-checked all the safety equipment. Jenny arrived next, followed gradually by the 8 divers who'd signed up for the expedition. They were a mixed group. There was Brad and Melissa Chen, a married couple in their 30s who'd been diving for 5 years. Frank Morrison, a retired police officer from Seattle with over 200 logged dives. Paula and Eric Santos, young professionals from Portland who'd completed their advanced certification just 3 months ago. And 3 college students, Tyler, Maya, and Jordan, who were on spring break and eager to add an exciting dive to their trip. Caroline gathered everyone on the dock before boarding. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline, and I'll be your dive guide today. I've dove the Catherine about 15 times, and she's one of my favorite wrecks. But before we get on the boat, I need to go over some important safety information." She walked them through the dive plan. The SS Catherine was a cargo ship that had been sunk by a German U-boat in 1943. She rested at 83 feet, lying on her starboard side. The plan was to descend the anchor line, explore the exterior of the wreck, and then carefully penetrate the cargo hold and main deck if conditions allowed. Total dive time would be about 35 minutes, with a 3-minute safety stop at 15 feet on ascent. "The Catherine has been down there for 80 years, Caroline emphasized. "She's stable, but she's still a wreck. We're going to treat her with respect. That means no touching or pulling on anything, no stirring up sediment, and absolutely no penetration beyond the areas I specifically clear. We stay together as a group. If anyone gets separated, surface along the anchor line and wait on the boat. Are we clear?" Everyone nodded. Caroline studied their faces, looking for signs of nervousness or overconfidence. Both could be dangerous. But this group seemed solid, experienced enough to be competent, not so experienced that they'd take unnecessary risks. They loaded onto the boat and motored out of the harbor. Oakmere fell away behind them, and soon they were in open water heading southwest toward the coordinates of the wreck. The ocean was calm, the sun warm, and the mood on the boat was cheerful. People chatted about previous dives, checked their cameras, and peered over the side, trying to spot marine life. Caroline sat near the stern, running through mental calculations. 83 feet meant a no decompression limit of about 40 minutes at the deepest point. They'd planned for 35 to be safe. Air consumption at that depth meant they needed to watch their gauges carefully. Entry points into the cargo hold were the large breach in the hull and the smaller loading hatch near the stern. Both stable, according to her last dive here 6 months ago. "Penny for your thoughts?" Marcus settled onto the bench beside her. "Just planning," Caroline said. "You always do." He studied her for a moment. "You know, in all the years I've known you, I've never quite figured you out." Caroline felt a flicker of alarm. "What do you mean?" "You're the best diver I've ever worked with. Natural teacher, calm under pressure, encyclopedic knowledge of diving theory. But you never talk about where you learned all this. You never mentioned diving before you came to Oakmere." He held up his hands. "I'm not prying. Everyone's entitled to their privacy, but sometimes I wonder what your story is." "It's not very interesting," Caroline said lightly. "I learned to dive in my 20s, worked some commercial diving jobs, decided I wanted a quieter life. Here I am." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had learned to dive in her 20s. It had been a requirement for her submarine engineering work, and she'd fallen in love with it. and she had wanted a quieter life. The parts she left out were the years of advanced training, the classified military projects, the innovative deep-sea rescue systems she'd designed, and the prestigious position she'd walked away from. Well, whatever your story is, I'm glad you ended up here. Marcus stood as they approached their destination. Looks like we're at the site. Let's get these folks in the water. They anchored directly over the wreck, and Caroline began her briefing. Remember, we descend together, explore together, and ascend together. Follow my lead, watch your air consumption, and enjoy the dive. The Catherine is a beautiful piece of history, and we're privileged to visit her. The group geared up, running through their buddy checks. Caroline partnered with Jenny. She always dove with her assistant on group dives, both for safety and to have another experienced diver helping to manage the group. They did a final check of everyone's equipment, and then it was time to enter the water. The ocean welcomed Caroline like an old friend. She descended slowly down the anchor line, equalizing her ears as the pressure increased. The water here was a deep blue-green, visibility easily over 60 feet. Below her, the shadowy shape of the Catherine gradually came into focus. Even after all these years, the sight of the wreck still moved her. The ship lay on her side, her hull covered in marine growth and rust. Fish swam in and out of the openings, and colorful anemones clung to every available surface. She'd been a working vessel once, carrying cargo across the Atlantic, manned by sailors who'd never made it home. Now she was something else, a monument, a reef, a reminder of the ocean's power to both take and give life. Caroline reached the deck of the ship at 80 feet and waited there as the group gathered around her. She checked each diver with a questioning gesture. Everyone gave her the okay sign. Good. They proceeded along the exterior of the wreck, Caroline pointing out features of interest. The ship's name still faintly visible on the bow, a massive anchor chain, the remains of the bridge. The group moved well together, staying close and maintaining good buoyancy. Caroline kept constant track of everyone's position, counting heads every 30 seconds. Brad and Melissa were filming with a GoPro. Frank was taking photographs. The college students swam in a tight cluster, clearly excited. Paula and Eric held hands, occasionally stopping to point out fish to each other. After 15 minutes of exploring the exterior, Caroline led them toward the cargo hold. The breach in the hull was large enough to admit 2 divers at a time, and the interior was spacious, about 20 by 30 feet, with the floor tilted at a 45-degree angle due to the ship's list. She'd been inside dozens of times and knew it was safe as long as they were careful. She gestured for everyone to wait and entered first with Jenny. They swam through slowly, checking the structure. Everything looked stable, no signs of recent collapse or weakness. She turned and signaled for the others to follow, 2 at a time. Inside the cargo hold, shafts of blue-green light filtered down through openings in the deck above. Schools of fish moved like silver clouds. Old cargo crates, long since emptied, were scattered across the tilted floor. It was peaceful, almost cathedral-like. Caroline positioned herself near the exit, counting as each pair entered. Brad and Melissa, Frank and Tyler, Maya and Jordan. That was everyone except... Where were Paula and Eric? She looked back toward the entrance. The young couple wasn't there. Caroline's heartbeat picked up slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm. They'd probably stopped to look at something outside. She signaled to Jenny to keep the group together and swam back out through the breach. Outside the cargo hold, visibility remained excellent. Caroline scanned the area methodically. There, about 30 feet away, near the stern of the ship, she could see 2 divers hovering near a smaller opening in the hull. Relief flooded through her. She swam over to collect them. But as she got closer, she realized something was wrong. The 2 divers weren't just hovering, they were struggling with something. And they weren't Paula and Eric. These tanks had different color markings. Before Caroline could process this, there was a deep, grinding sound that she felt more than heard. The ocean around them shuddered. Caroline turned back toward the cargo hold just as a massive section of the ship's upper deck, weakened by 8 decades of corrosion, gave way with terrifying slowness. Tons of rusted metal collapsed downward, slamming into the breach in the hull, the entrance to the cargo hold where 6 people were still inside. The opening was completely blocked. For a frozen moment, Caroline couldn't move, couldn't think. This couldn't be happening. Not again. Not after all these years. Not when she'd promised herself she'd only do simple, safe dives. Then training and instinct kicked in. She checked her dive computer, 21 minutes into the dive. The people in the cargo hold had air for maybe 15 more minutes, less if they panicked. They were trapped in a space with limited exits, and she was the only one out here who could help them. She spotted Marcus descending rapidly from the boat, having seen the collapse from above. She swam to him, her mind already working through solutions with the cold precision she'd thought she'd left behind. They had to get those people out, and they had to do it fast. Caroline Reed, submarine engineer, had returned. Marcus's eyes were wide behind his mask. He gestured frantically toward the collapsed entrance, then toward the surface. "Get help? Call for rescue?" Caroline grabbed his arm and shook her head firmly. No time. She checked her computer again. 22 minutes into the dive. 11 minutes of no decompression time remaining at this depth. The people inside had even less. By the time help arrived from shore, they'd be out of air. She had to think. The cargo hold had one main entrance, now blocked by thousands of pounds of rusted deck plating. But the SS Catherine was a cargo ship, which meant she'd been designed for loading and unloading heavy goods. There would be other access points. Caroline closed her eyes for 3 seconds, forcing her mind to work through what she knew about ships of this era. The Catherine was a Liberty-class cargo vessel, roughly 440 feet long, built for wartime efficiency. She'd have multiple cargo holds, accessed by large hatches on the main deck, but those hatches would be 40 feet higher up, on what was now the port side of the tilted wreck. More importantly, there would be internal access routes, ladders and passages connecting the holds to the crew quarters and engineering spaces. Her eyes snapped open. The loading hatch. There was a secondary loading hatch near the stern that she'd noted on previous dives. It had always been rusted shut, too dangerous to try opening. But desperate times called for desperate measures. She grabbed her underwater slate and wrote rapidly, "Follow me. Other entrance." She showed it to Marcus, then swam toward the stern of the ship, moving fast but not panicking. Panic consumed oxygen, and she needed every breath. The 2 mystery divers, she still didn't know who they were, saw her coming and tried to intercept. Caroline waved them off sharply. Whatever they'd been doing could wait. She reached the stern section and began searching the hull. There. The loading hatch was a square metal frame, about 3 feet on each side, set into the hull of the ship. Years of marine growth covered it, and the hinges were completely rusted. But through the gaps around the edges, Caroline could see into the darkness of the interior. This was an access point to a secondary cargo space that connected to the main hold through an internal passage. She pulled her dive knife and began scraping away growth and debris from around the hatch edges. Marcus joined her, using his own knife. The metal was fragile, flaking away under their efforts. Good. That meant they might be able to pry it open. Caroline braced herself against the hull and gripped the edge of the hatch. She pulled. Nothing. She adjusted her position and pulled harder, using her legs for leverage. The hatch groaned and moved slightly. Just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. Marcus added his strength to hers. Together they heaved. The ancient hinges screamed in protest, but the hatch began to open. Inch by inch, they forced it wider. 3 inches, 6 inches. At about 8 inches, Caroline judged it was enough for a diver to squeeze through. She checked her computer, 26 minutes into the dive. The people inside had been trapped for 4 minutes. She showed Marcus her slate. I go in, you stay. Guide them out. Marcus shook his head vigorously, pointing at himself. He should go. But Caroline knew this was her responsibility. She'd led this dive. She'd cleared the cargo hold as safe. And more than that, she had knowledge that Marcus didn't. She'd spent 25 years designing and testing systems for enclosed underwater spaces. She understood structural stability, emergency egress, and rescue procedures in ways that no ordinary dive instructor ever could. She pointed at herself more emphatically. Then she squeezed through the hatch opening before Marcus could argue further. The space beyond was dark and disorienting. Caroline switched on her dive light, revealing a narrow vertical shaft that had once been a loading passage. Debris floated everywhere, bits of wood, metal fragments, clouds of sediment stirred up by the collapse. She pulled herself downward, following the shaft as it curved and widened into a small chamber. This was the secondary cargo space, maybe 10 by 10 feet, filled with the remnants of old crates and equipment. On the far side, she could see the passage that should lead to the main hold. But between her and that passage was a tangled mess of fallen support beams and deck plating that had cascaded down from above. Caroline's pulse was steady, her breathing controlled. This was like being inside a damaged submarine. Claustrophobic, unstable, with lives depending on her ability to navigate safely. She'd trained for this. She'd lived this. All the old instincts came roaring back. She approached the debris field carefully, testing each piece before putting weight on it. Some was loose and shifted dangerously. Other pieces were wedged tight. She spotted a gap near the bottom, maybe 2 feet high, that might lead through to the other side. Caroline squeezed into the gap, pulling herself forward with her hands. The walls pressed in on both sides. A piece of jagged metal caught her wetsuit, tearing it but not cutting her skin. She kept moving, focusing on her breathing, on the goal ahead. And then she was through, emerging into the main cargo hold from an unexpected angle, near the floor, in the corner. She swept her light around and counted 6 divers, all alive, all together. Jenny was keeping them calm, positioned near the blocked entrance. When Caroline's light found them, she saw Jenny's body language shift from tense worry to profound relief. Caroline swam to the group and immediately began assessing. She checked each diver's air gauge. Brad had 1,200 psi, about 10 minutes left. Melissa had 1,400. Frank looked good at 1,800. The 3 college students were at 1,100, 1,000, and 900. That last one, Jordan, was breathing too fast, probably panicking. She wrote on her slate, "Exit found, follow me, stay calm." Jenny nodded and began organizing the group. Caroline swam back toward her entry point, but as she approached the debris field, she realized a problem. The gap she'd squeezed through was passable for her, barely. But it would be nearly impossible for less experienced divers, especially ones who were scared and running low on air. They might get stuck. They might panic. They might die in this rusted metal tomb. She needed to widen the gap. Caroline studied the debris pile with an engineer's eye. The main obstruction was a large section of deck plating, maybe 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. It was lying diagonally across the passage, supported on one end by a pile of smaller debris, and on the other end by a support beam that had wedged into the wall. If she could shift that support beam, the whole section might slide out of the way. Or it might collapse further and block the passage entirely. Or it might fall on someone and crush them. She checked her computer. 32 minutes into the dive. 4 minutes of no decompression time remaining. They needed to leave now. Caroline made her decision. She positioned herself at the support beam and began working it loose. The metal was corroded and flaky, but the beam itself was still structurally sound. She wedged her knife into a gap and levered. The beam shifted. Behind her, she sensed the 6 divers gathering, watching. Jenny had brought them over. Good. They needed to be ready to move fast. Caroline levered again. The beam moved another inch. The deck plating above it groaned. She froze, waiting to see if it would collapse. It held, but now it was tilted at a steeper angle. One more pull. She gripped the beam with both hands and heaved with everything she had. The beam came free with a shower of rust particles. The deck plating slid sideways with a horrible grinding sound, and the passage opened up, now 3 feet high and clear. Caroline pointed. Jenny immediately understood and began guiding divers through, one at a time. Tyler went first, then Maya, then Jordan with his dangerously low air supply. Frank followed, then Brad and Melissa. Finally, Jenny herself squeezed through. Caroline came last, pulling herself through the passage one more time and up the vertical shaft to the hatch where Marcus waited. One by one, he helped pull the divers out into open water. Caroline emerged last and immediately began herding everyone toward the anchor line. They ascended as a group, Caroline and Jenny taking positions at the rear to make sure no one fell behind. 15 feet from the surface, Caroline made them all stop for a safety stop, despite the fact that they'd already exceeded their no decompression limit. Better to risk mild decompression sickness than guarantee it by skipping the stop. 3 minutes felt like an eternity. Caroline watched each diver, looking for signs of trouble. Jordan's breathing was still too fast, but he was following instructions. Everyone else seemed stable. The surface beckoned above them, bright and shimmering. Finally, it was time. They surfaced into brilliant sunshine, and Caroline heard multiple gasps and cries of relief. The sea breeze runner was right there, and other boats had gathered. Someone must have called for help. Hands reached down to pull divers aboard. Caroline waited until everyone else was on the boat before hauling herself up. Her legs felt shaky, her hands trembling with delayed adrenaline. As soon as her fins were off, Marcus grabbed her in a fierce hug. "You did it," he said. "You saved them all." The deck was chaos. People were crying, hugging, checking their equipment as if they couldn't quite believe they were safe. Jenny was being sick over the side. The college students were wrapped in blankets, their faces pale. Brad held Melissa, both of them shaking. But everyone was alive. Everyone was safe. Caroline sank onto a bench and closed her eyes. In her mind, she was 25 years old again, sitting in a control room, listening to the radio signals from a doomed submarine grow weaker and weaker, and finally fall silent. 7 people she couldn't save. This time was different. This time she'd been enough. Caroline? She opened her eyes. Frank, the retired police officer, was standing in front of her with an odd expression on his face. "That was what you did in there? That wasn't normal dive instructor stuff. How did you know?" He stopped, studying her face. "Who are you?" Before she could answer, one of the 2 mystery divers she'd seen earlier pulled himself aboard the runner. He removed his mask, revealing a young man in his mid-20s with a bleeding cut on his forehead. His buddy, a young woman, followed him up. "What the hell were you 2 doing?" Marcus demanded. "You weren't part of our group." The young man looked terrified. "We're grad students from Portland." "Marine archaeology. We heard about the Catherine and wanted to check out the engine room section. We didn't think anyone else would be here today." "You caused that collapse." Jenny's voice was sharp with anger. "We saw you." You were pulling on something near the stern. We didn't mean to. We were just trying to document some of the structural features. And there was this panel that looked interesting. And when we tried to shift it, the young woman was crying now. We didn't know anyone was inside. We didn't know the structure was that unstable. Oh God, we could have killed people. Marcus looked like he wanted to throw them overboard, but Caroline held up a hand. It's done. Everyone's safe, but you two are going to have a lot of explaining to do to the Coast Guard. As if on cue, a Coast Guard vessel appeared on the horizon, racing toward them. Someone had definitely called this in. They'd all be questioned, statements would be taken, and there would be investigations. The whole story would come out. Caroline looked around at the 8 divers she'd saved. At Jenny, still pale but recovering. At Marcus, who'd trusted her instincts without question. At Frank, who was still studying her with that penetrating cop stare. For 25 years, she'd hidden. She'd been small and quiet and invisible. She'd convinced herself that the woman she used to be was dead, that Dr. Caroline Reed was better off buried alongside the people she'd failed to save. But today had proven otherwise. Today had shown her that she couldn't escape who she really was, and more importantly, that maybe she shouldn't try. The Coast Guard pulled alongside, and uniformed officers began boarding the runner. One of them, a woman in her 40s with commander's stripes, looked around at the shaken group. I'm Commander Patricia Hayes. Who's in charge of this dive? Caroline stood up, still in her wetsuit, her silver hair plastered to her skull, her hands steady now. I am. The Coast Guard station in Oakmere was a modern building near the harbor, all glass and steel painted in crisp white and blue. Caroline sat in a conference room with Commander Hayes and 2 other officers, going through her statement for the 3rd time. Through the window, she could see the sea breeze runner tied up at the dock, looking harmless in the afternoon light. Let me make sure I understand, Commander Hayes said, reviewing her notes. You led a group dive to the SS Catherine. While the group was exploring the cargo hold, an unaffiliated pair of divers caused a structural collapse that trapped 6 people inside. You entered through an alternative access point, cleared a debris field, and led all 6 to safety. Does that about cover it? Yes, ma'am. Ms. Reed, in my 20 years with the Coast Guard, I've seen a lot of dive emergencies. Most of them end badly. Trapped divers underwater usually either panic and die of air starvation, or they're killed in subsequent collapses. What you did, navigating an unfamiliar internal passage in a collapsing wreck, improvising a rescue route, managing 6 panicked divers, that's not something your average dive instructor can do. Hayes leaned forward. Where did you learn those skills? This was the question Caroline had been dreading. She could lie, give some vague answer about commercial diving experience. But the lie felt too heavy now, too much like betraying the person she'd been today when she'd needed all her old training and knowledge. I used to be a submarine engineer, Caroline said quietly. I worked on military and civilian projects involving deep-sea rescue systems. I know how to navigate enclosed underwater spaces because I used to design them. The room went very quiet. Hayes's eyebrows rose. What kind of projects? Classified mostly. But I can tell you I worked for Trident Marine Systems and later for the Naval Research Laboratory. I specialized in emergency egress systems and structural failure analysis. Caroline met the commander's eyes. I left the field 25 years ago after an accident. I haven't used that expertise since, until today. Why did you leave? Caroline's throat tightened. A submarine I'd worked on had a catastrophic failure during sea trials. 7 people died. I couldn't continue after that. Understanding flickered in Hayes's face. The Argonaut Incident, 2000. I remember that. It was all over the news. Experimental deep-sea research submarine, hydraulic system failure at 800 meters. She paused. You were part of that team? I was the senior submarine engineer on the project. Jesus. Hayes sat back. That was ruled a manufacturing defect. The official report cleared the design team. I know, it didn't help. Caroline's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. So I came here. I became someone else. Someone simple and safe who taught tourists to dive and never had to think about pressure hulls or system redundancies or how to save people trapped in failing vessels. Until today. Until today. Hayes studied her for a long moment. For what it's worth, Ms. Reed, what you did out there was extraordinary. You saved 6 lives because you had knowledge and skills that no one else on that boat possessed. I'd say that's a pretty good use of your expertise. Caroline felt something break loose inside her chest. Not quite relief, not quite grief, but something in between. Thank you. The interview wrapped up shortly after. They'd taken statements from all the divers, including the 2 graduate students who'd caused the collapse. Those 2 would likely face charges for reckless diving and endangering others, but that wasn't Caroline's problem. Her part was done. She stepped out of the Coast Guard station into late afternoon sunshine. A crowd had gathered across the street. She recognized half the town. News traveled fast in Oakmere, and a dramatic rescue was big news. As soon as people saw her, they started clapping. Caroline froze, uncertain how to react. She'd spent 25 years trying not to be noticed, and now she was the center of attention for the entire town. It was her worst nightmare and somehow also a strange relief. Martha from the cafe was there, and Tom, the harbor master, and Jenny with her parents, and dozens of others. They surged forward, calling out thanks and congratulations. Caroline was pulled into hugs, had her hand shaken so many times it hurt, and heard, "You're a hero," about 50 times in 3 minutes. Okay, give her some space. Marcus pushed through the crowd and wrapped a protective arm around Caroline's shoulders. She's been answering questions for 3 hours. Let the woman breathe. He guided her through the crowd and back toward the dive shop. People followed, still calling out thanks and well wishes. Caroline felt overwhelmed and exposed in a way she hadn't experienced in decades. You okay? Marcus asked quietly as they walked. I don't know, Caroline admitted. This is a lot. I can imagine. Listen, why don't you take tomorrow off? Hell, take the whole week off. You've earned it. They reached Seabreeze, and Marcus unlocked the door, ushering her inside and shutting out the crowd. The shop was blessedly quiet. Caroline sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. Do you want to talk about it? Marcus asked. The submarine engineer thing? Caroline looked up. You heard? Everyone heard. Coast Guard Station has thin walls, and you know how people gossip in this town. He sat down across from her. So, Dr. Caroline Reed, submarine engineer. That explains a lot, actually. Your technical knowledge, the way you teach safety protocols, how you think through problems. I always knew there was more to you than you let on. I never meant to lie to you. You didn't lie. You just didn't tell the whole truth. That's different. Marcus leaned forward. Caroline, I don't care what you used to be. You've been a damn good instructor for me for 15 years, and you saved 6 lives today. That's what matters. But everyone knows now. The whole town knows. I can't just be normal Caroline anymore. Maybe normal Caroline was never real in the first place, Marcus said gently. Maybe you were always Dr. Reed, just hiding. And maybe after today, you don't have to hide anymore. Caroline sat with that thought as Marcus got up to make coffee. Through the window, she could see people still gathered outside, still talking excitedly about the rescue. Her quiet life was over. The secret she'd guarded so carefully was public knowledge. Everything was going to change. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Her phone buzzed, a text from Jenny. "Thank you for saving my life." "I mean it. You're amazing, and I'm so proud to know you." Another text from Brad. "You're a genuine hero." "Thank you for bringing me and Melissa home safe." More messages flooded in. Frank, the ex-cop. "I knew there was something special about you. Thank you." Tyler. "You're like a superhero." Paula. "We owe you everything." Caroline scrolled through them all, her eyes stinging. These people were alive because of her, because she'd had the knowledge and the training and the courage to act when it mattered most. That had to count for something. Marcus returned with 2 mugs of coffee and sat down again. "So, what happens now?" "I don't know," Caroline said honestly. "I suppose I go back to teaching diving." "You could." Or ... quote. Marcus hesitated. "Look, I'm just going to put this out there. What happened today is going to get attention, big attention, local news, maybe national news. And when people hear about a submarine engineer who's been quietly working as a dive instructor, who saved 6 people from a collapsed wreck using elite specialized knowledge, they're going to want more of that story. I don't want attention. I know, but you might not have a choice now. And if you're going to be in the spotlight anyway, maybe think about what you could do with it. You have knowledge that could help people. You could consult on dive safety, work with the Coast Guard on rescue protocols, maybe even teach more advanced courses. You don't have to hide anymore." Caroline sipped her coffee, thinking. For 25 years, she'd run from her past. She'd convinced herself that her specialized knowledge was dangerous, that using it would only lead to more failure and more grief. But today had proven that wasn't true. Today, her knowledge had saved lives. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Fair enough." Marcus stood. "Come on, I'll drive you home. You look exhausted." She was exhausted, bone-deep tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical effort of the dive and everything to do with the emotional weight of the day. Marcus dropped her off at her cottage, and she let herself in, grateful for the quiet. But the quiet didn't last long. Her phone kept buzzing with messages, and eventually she turned it off. She made herself dinner without really tasting it, then sat on her back porch and watched the sun set over the ocean. Her mind kept replaying the day, the grinding sound of the collapse, the darkness inside the wreck, the feeling of clearing that debris field, knowing that lives depended on her getting it right, the relief of seeing everyone surface safely. And underneath it all, a question. What if this had been a test? What if the universe had thrown this challenge at her specifically to show her that she was done running? Caroline thought about Sarah, her friend who died in the Argonaut. If Sarah could see her now, what would she say? Would she be disappointed that Caroline had hidden for 25 years? Or would she understand the grief and guilt that had driven her away? She thought about the 7 people who'd died, whose faces she still saw sometimes in her dreams. She'd spent so long thinking about what she'd failed to do for them. Maybe it was time to think about what she could do for others because of them. Her phone, turned back on, rang. An unknown number. Caroline almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello? Miss Reed? This is Patricia Hayes, Coast Guard Commander. I hope I'm not calling too late." "No, it's fine. What can I do for you?" "What?" "I wanted to follow up on something. Based on your expertise and what you demonstrated today, I'd like to talk to you about consulting for us. We deal with diving emergencies and underwater rescue situations fairly regularly, and we could use someone with your background to help with training and protocols. Would you be interested in discussing this?" Caroline's first instinct was to say no, but she caught herself. This was exactly what Marcus had been talking about. An opportunity to use her knowledge in a way that could help people. A chance to stop hiding. Yes, she heard herself say. I'd be interested. Excellent. Can you come by the station tomorrow afternoon? Say around 2? I'll be there. She hung up and sat very still, realizing what she'd just done. She'd taken the first step toward reclaiming her old life. Or maybe not her old life exactly. Something new, something that combined who she used to be with who she'd become. The evening darkened into night. Caroline stayed on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, thinking about second chances and redemption and the strange paths life took. She'd spent 25 years trying to atone for a failure that hadn't been her fault. Maybe it was time to forgive herself. Maybe it was time to accept that she couldn't change the past, but she could still shape the future. Tomorrow she'd meet with Commander Hayes. Tomorrow she'd start figuring out what Dr. Caroline Reed could offer the world. Tomorrow she'd begin the process of stepping out of the shadows. But tonight, she just sat with the ocean and the stars and the knowledge that 6 people were alive because of her. For now, that was enough. The next morning, Caroline woke early and went for a walk along the beach before the town woke up. The sand was cool under her bare feet, and the waves whispered their eternal rhythm. She needed this quiet time to think, to process everything that had happened. But even the beach wasn't quite as peaceful as usual. As she walked, she saw people setting up for the day. Fishermen preparing their boats, early morning joggers, a few other walkers, and every single one of them stopped to acknowledge her. Some waved, some called out thanks, a few even applauded. "You're famous now," said a voice behind her. Caroline turned to find Frank Morrison, the retired police officer from yesterday's dive. He was in running clothes, clearly out for his morning exercise. His face was bruised from the ordeal, but he looked steady and strong. "I didn't want to be famous," Caroline said. "I don't think you get a choice in that." Frank fell into step beside her. "Mind if I walk with you?" I wanted to talk. "Sure." They walked in silence for a moment, and then Frank said, "I spent 30 years as a cop. I learned to read people pretty well. And you, Caroline, you were always an interesting puzzle. The way you taught diving, the precision of your instructions, the way you thought through every possible emergency scenario. I thought maybe you'd been military or search and rescue or something like that. But submarine engineer? That's next level. It was a long time ago. And yet yesterday you snapped back into it like you'd never left. That kind of expertise doesn't fade." Frank stopped walking and turned to face her. "I looked you up last night. Dr. Caroline Reed, formerly of Trident Marine Systems and the Naval Research Laboratory, published about 40 papers on submarine design and underwater rescue systems. Holder of 6 patents. Recipient of the Marine Technology Society's Compass Award. You were a big deal." Caroline felt exposed. "I'm not that person anymore." "Aren't you?" Because what I saw yesterday was exactly that person. Someone who could analyze a dangerous situation, improvise solutions, and execute a rescue under extreme pressure. That's not something you unlearn. I left that world for good reasons. The Argonaut incident, I read about that too. Frank's voice was gentle. 7 dead. Must have been hell. It was... Caroline started walking again, needing to move. I blamed myself for years. I went over every calculation, every design decision, every test. I kept thinking if I'd been smarter or more careful or more thorough, I would have caught the flaw. But it wasn't your flaw. It was a manufacturing defect. I know. Intellectually, I know, but emotionally, I felt responsible for those 7 lives, so I ran. I found the smallest, quietest place I could and I disappeared. I thought if I never designed another submarine, never worked on another complex system, I couldn't fail again. I couldn't get anyone else killed. Frank nodded slowly. I get it. I really do. After I retired from the force, I left Seattle because I couldn't handle the memories. Too many bad calls, too many people I couldn't save. I came here thinking I'd just fade away. But you know what? You can't run from yourself. Your skills, your knowledge, your experience, that's part of who you are. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. Maybe not. But using it is terrifying. Of course it is. Because it matters. Because lives might depend on it. But that's exactly why you should use it. Frank put a hand on her shoulder. Yesterday, you saved 6 people, including me. You did that because you had rare and valuable knowledge that you were willing to apply in a crisis. The world needs more of that, not less. Caroline didn't know what to say. They reached the end of the beach and stood looking out at the ocean, both lost in their own thoughts. What are you going to do now? Frank asked. I'm meeting with the Coast Guard this afternoon. They want to talk about consulting work. That's good. That's a start. He smiled. For what it's worth, I think Dr. Caroline Reed is a pretty impressive person. Maybe she deserves another chance. They walked back toward town together. By the time Caroline reached her cottage, the sun was fully up and Oakmere was waking to another day. She showered, dressed in clean clothes, and tried to prepare mentally for the meeting ahead. At noon, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Jenny standing there with a bag of food from Martha's Cafe. I brought lunch, Jenny announced, and I'm not taking no for an answer. We need to talk. They sat at Caroline's small kitchen table, and Jenny unpacked sandwiches, soup, and cookies. For a few minutes, they just ate, but Caroline could feel questions building in her young friend. Finally, Jenny said, Why didn't you tell me? All this time, I thought you were I thought you were an experienced diver, but I didn't know you were some kind of genius engineer who designed submarines. It wasn't relevant to teaching open water certification. Come on, that's not the real reason, Caroline sighed. You're right. The real reason is that I was ashamed. I failed at the most important project of my career. People died, and I couldn't face being that person anymore. So I became someone else. But you didn't fail. You said it yourself. It was a manufacturing defect. Doesn't matter. In my head, I was responsible, and the guilt was so crushing that I couldn't breathe. So I ran. Jenny was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Can I tell you something? When we were trapped in that cargo hold yesterday, I was terrified. I kept thinking about my family, about all the things I'd never get to do. And then your light appeared from that impossible angle, and I just knew, that you were going to get us out. Because that's who you are. You're the person who finds a way when there isn't one. I just did what anyone with my training would do. But that's the thing. Nobody else has your training. Nobody else in that town, maybe nobody else in this whole region, could have done what you did. And if you'd let your guilt bury you completely, if you'd refused to use your knowledge, then we'd all be dead. Jenny reached across the table and gripped Caroline's hand. I'm alive because you were willing to be Dr. Reed again, even just for an hour. Don't you see how important that is? Caroline felt tears pricking at her eyes. It's scary, Jenny. Using that part of myself again. What if I fail? What if next time I can't save everyone? Then you'll have tried, which is more than most people can say. And you'll know that you used your gifts instead of wasting them. Jenny squeezed her hand. Promise me something? Promise me you won't go back into hiding. The world needs Dr. Caroline Reed. I don't know if I can promise that. Then promise you'll try. That's all anyone can ask. Caroline looked at this young woman who'd become her friend, who'd been through hell yesterday and had emerged with her faith and optimism intact. I promise I'll try. Jenny smiled. Good. Now eat your soup before it gets cold, and then go to that Coast Guard meeting and show them what you're made of. At 2:00, Caroline walked into the Coast Guard station, her heart pounding but her shoulders square. Commander Hayes greeted her warmly and led her to the same conference room where she'd been interviewed the day before. Thank you for coming, Hayes said. I'll get right to the point. Based on what happened yesterday and your background, I'd like to offer you a consulting position with the Coast Guard. Specifically, we need expertise in underwater structural assessment, dive rescue protocols, and emergency response training. You'd work with our teams to improve our procedures and train personnel for complex rescue scenarios. Caroline had expected this, but hearing it stated so directly still made her stomach flip. That's quite a responsibility. It is, but you're uniquely qualified. How many people in the country have your combination of submarine engineering expertise and practical diving rescue experience? Not many, Caroline admitted. None that I've been able to find, Hayes said bluntly. Dr. Reed, I've been doing search and rescue for 20 years, and I've seen situations that should have been survivable turn deadly because responders didn't have the right knowledge. You have knowledge that could save lives. I'm asking you to share it. It was the same argument Frank and Jenny had made. Caroline could feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure to be something more than she'd allowed herself to be for 25 years. But she was also starting to feel something else, a tiny spark of the excitement she used to feel when facing a challenging engineering problem. The intellectual satisfaction of applying expertise to real-world situations. The sense of purpose that came from knowing your work mattered. What exactly would this position involve? She asked. Over the next hour, Hayes laid out the details. Caroline would work as an independent consultant, setting her own hours. She'd review Coast Guard dive rescue protocols, suggest improvements, and help develop training scenarios. She'd be on call for emergencies where her expertise might be relevant. And she'd give workshops to Coast Guard dive teams on topics like structural assessment, underwater navigation in confined spaces, and rescue planning. We can start small if you prefer, Hayes said. Maybe a one-day workshop next month, see how it goes. No pressure to commit to anything long-term until you're comfortable. Caroline thought about it. One workshop. She could do that. It didn't mean abandoning the life she'd built in Oakmere. It just meant allowing herself to use the knowledge she'd spent decades acquiring. All right, she said. I'll do the workshop. We can go from there. Hayes smiled. Excellent. I'll send you details next week. And Dr. Reed? Thank you. This is going to make a real difference. As Caroline left the Coast Guard station, she felt lighter somehow. She'd taken a step toward reclaiming a part of herself that she'd thought was lost forever. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She walked slowly back toward the waterfront, thinking about the future. Maybe she could find a balance, keep teaching diving at Seabreeze, but also work with the Coast Guard. Keep living in Oakmere, but also engage with the wider world of marine safety. Keep being Caroline the dive instructor, while also acknowledging Dr. Reed, the engineer. Caroline! She turned to see Marcus jogging toward her, looking excited. I've been trying to call you. Your phone's off. Sorry, I had it on silent for the meeting. What's up? You're not going to believe this, but we've had about 20 inquiries today from people who want to take diving lessons specifically from you. Apparently, the story of yesterday's rescue has gone viral. There's a video on YouTube with 3 million views. Someone filmed the whole thing from a boat nearby. Caroline felt dizzy. 3 million views? Yeah, and that's not all. I got a call from a production company asking if you'd be interested in consulting on a documentary about diving safety, and another call from a dive magazine wanting to interview you, and... Marcus stopped, studying her face. You okay? You look pale. This is a lot. I'm not used to attention. I know, but here's the thing. You can control how much you engage with it. You don't have to do every interview or take every opportunity. But you do have a platform now, if you want to use it. You could really make an impact on dive safety across the industry. Caroline leaned against the seawall, trying to process. 24 hours ago, she'd been nobody special. Just a quiet dive instructor in a small town. Now she was apparently internet famous, and people were lining up to learn from her or work with her. What if I mess it up? She said quietly. What if I say yes to all this, and then I fail again? What if someone else gets hurt because I gave bad advice or missed something important? Marcus sat down beside her on the seawall. Caroline, you've been giving good advice for 15 years, and nobody's gotten hurt on your watch. Yesterday you saved 6 lives. Those aren't the actions of someone who's going to mess up. Yeah, you'll make mistakes sometimes. Everyone does. But your knowledge and experience are valuable. Hiding them helps no one. Everyone keeps saying that because it's true. Look, I'm not going to push you, but I think you need to at least consider that maybe, just maybe, this is happening for a reason. Maybe you were meant to be in Oakmere for 25 years, learning to heal, and now you're meant to step back into the world and share what you know. Caroline watched a fishing boat make its way into the harbor, its nets heavy with the day's catch. Life in Oakmere had always seemed to follow simple, predictable patterns, but maybe simplicity was overrated. Maybe it was time for something more complicated, more challenging, more meaningful. I'm scared, she admitted. Good. That means it matters. Marcus stood and offered her his hand. Come on, let's go back to the shop. We've got students waiting for their lessons and life goes on. You don't have to decide everything today. She took his hand and let him pull her up. They walked back to Seabreeze together, and Caroline tried to focus on the familiar, comforting routine of teaching diving. But in the back of her mind, she could feel something shifting. The woman she'd been for 25 years, small, hidden, safe, was starting to give way to someone new. Or maybe not new at all. Maybe she was just finally allowing herself to be whole again. That evening, Caroline sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, something she rarely used. She'd spent most of the day deliberately avoiding the internet, but now she was curious. She pulled up YouTube and searched for Oakmere Diving Rescue. The video was there, the top result. 3.5 million views now. She clicked play. The footage was shaky, but clear enough. It had been filmed from another boat about 100 yards away. She watched the dive boats arrive, watched people enter the water, and then, there. The moment of collapse. The way the deck plating fell in slow motion, sealing the cargo hold entrance. The confusion as people on boats realized what had happened. Then her own figure, emerging with the mystery divers, swimming fast toward the stern. The camera couldn't follow her into the wreck, but it captured the tense minutes of waiting. And finally, the emergence. 1 diver, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then Caroline herself, last to surface. The comment section was filled with praise and speculation. Who is this woman? That was incredible skill. She saved everyone. I want to learn to dive from her. Caroline closed the laptop, feeling overwhelmed. This was her life now. Public, examined, discussed by strangers. Part of her wanted to run again, find a new small town where nobody knew her name. But another part, a part she'd kept locked away for too long, felt a spark of pride. She had saved everyone. She had used her knowledge for good. She had proven to herself that Dr. Caroline Reed wasn't defined by one failure 25 years ago. Her phone rang. Another unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Dr. Reed? My name is Professor Michael Torres from MIT's Ocean Engineering Department. I hope this isn't a bad time. MIT, her alma mater where she'd earned her PhD 30 years ago. It's fine. What can I do for you? I saw the video of your rescue yesterday, and I did some research. I remember your work on submarine emergency systems from the late 90s. Brilliant stuff. I actually cite your 1998 paper on pressure hull integrity in my advanced structures course. Caroline was stunned. You cite my work? Of course. It's foundational to the field. Listen, I'm calling because we're hosting a symposium on maritime safety next month, and I'd love to have you as a speaker. We'd cover all expenses, and it would just be an hour-long presentation on whatever aspect of diving or submarine safety you're most passionate about. A speaking engagement at MIT. Caroline's first instinct was to say no, but she stopped herself. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Marcus and Jenny had been talking about. A chance to share her knowledge with the next generation of marine engineers. I'll think about it, she said. Can you send me the details? Absolutely. Dr. Reed, I really hope you'll consider it. Your perspective would be invaluable. After she hung up, Caroline sat very still. MIT wanted her to speak. The Coast Guard wanted her to consult. Dive students wanted to learn from her. It was all happening so fast, pulling her back toward a world she'd left behind. But maybe that was okay. Maybe 25 years of healing was enough. Maybe it was time to stop running from her past and start embracing it. Not the guilt and grief, but the knowledge and expertise that could make a difference in people's lives. She pulled out a notebook and started writing. Lists of topics she could teach, ideas for improving dive safety protocols, outlines for presentations. Within an hour, she had pages of notes, her engineering brain fully engaged for the first time in decades. It felt good. It felt right. It felt like coming home. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity that left Caroline both exhausted and energized. She continued teaching at Seabreeze, that remained her anchor, the constant in a rapidly changing life. But she also began saying yes to opportunities that would have terrified her a month ago. She agreed to the MIT speaking engagement. She started working with Commander Hayes on a comprehensive review of Coast Guard dive rescue protocols. She gave an interview to Dive Training magazine about the Catherine rescue, carefully emphasizing that safety and preparation were more important than heroics. The attention was uncomfortable, but Caroline discovered that she could manage it by focusing on the substance rather than the spectacle. She wasn't interested in being famous. She was interested in improving dive safety. Every interview, every consultation, every teaching opportunity was a chance to share knowledge that might save someone's life someday. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the accident, Caroline was conducting a regular open water certification class in the pool. Her students were 4 retirees, 2 couples who decided to learn diving together. They were having trouble with the regulator recovery drill, and Caroline patiently demonstrated the technique for the 5th time. Don't overthink it, she told them. Just relax, sweep your arm back, feel for the hose, and bring it forward. The regulator wants to be found. It's buoyant and it's attached to you. Trust the process. Mary, one of the students, tried again and succeeded. She surfaced with a huge grin. I did it. You did. Great job. Caroline smiled. This part of her work, The simple pleasure of helping people overcome their fears and learn something new was what she'd missed most during her engineering years. Back then, she'd been so focused on complex problems and high stakes that she'd forgotten the satisfaction of basic human connection. After class, as she was cleaning up the pool area, Marcus approached her with an envelope. "This came for you today. Courier delivery." Caroline opened it and found an embossed invitation. The Oceanic Society was holding its annual gala in San Francisco next month and wanted to present her with their Civilian Heroism Award for the Catherine Rescue. There would be a formal dinner, a ceremony, and apparently several marine biology celebrities in attendance. "Are you going to go?" Marcus asked, reading over her shoulder. "I don't know. It seems excessive." "It's recognition for what you did." "Nothing wrong with accepting that." He paused. "Although I'll admit, the idea of you at a fancy gala is hard to picture. You're more of a jeans and coffee person." Caroline laughed. "I haven't worn formal clothes in about 20 years. I'm not even sure I own anything appropriate, so buy something new. Make an occasion of it." Marcus leaned against the wall. "You know what I think? I think you're afraid that accepting awards and recognition means you're accepting that you're back in the public eye for good. But Caroline, that ship has sailed. You're already there. Might as well enjoy it." He had a point. Her life had already changed irrevocably. Hiding in Oakmere and pretending nothing had happened wasn't an option anymore. She might as well embrace the change and see where it led. "Fine," she said. "I'll go to the gala." "That's the spirit. And hey, Jenny will be thrilled to help you shop for a dress. She's been dying to give you a makeover." The next week, Caroline found herself in a boutique in Portland with Jenny and Martha from the cafe, being fussed over by an enthusiastic saleswoman. After trying on what felt like 100 dresses, they finally found one that Caroline actually liked. A simple navy blue gown that was elegant without being fussy. "You look beautiful," Jenny said, and Martha nodded approvingly. Caroline studied herself in the mirror. She looked older than she remembered, the silver hair, the lines around her eyes. But she also looked strong, capable, and somehow more herself than she'd been in years. Maybe because she was finally allowing all parts of herself to exist simultaneously. The engineer and the teacher, the expert and the student, the person she'd been and the person she'd become. That evening, back in Oakmere, Caroline took her laptop to Martha's cafe and set up in a corner booth. She'd been avoiding this task, but it was time. She opened a blank document and began writing her presentation for the MIT symposium. The words came slowly at first. It had been so long since she'd thought in technical terms, organized complex information for an academic audience. But as she wrote, muscle memory took over. She outlined her presentation on submarine emergency egress systems, incorporating lessons learned from both the Argonaut tragedy and the Catherine rescue. She included technical specifications, case studies, and recommendations for future design improvements. After 2 hours, she had a solid draft. It wasn't perfect, but it was good. The work of someone who understood her subject deeply and could communicate it clearly. She saved the document and closed her laptop, feeling a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in decades. Working on something important, Martha appeared with a fresh pot of coffee. "Presentation for MIT next month. They want me to speak at a symposium on maritime safety." Martha whistled. "Fancy. Our little dive instructor is moving up in the world. I'm still your little dive instructor. This is just extra." "Honey, you were never just anything. Some of us could tell you were special from the day you arrived in Oakmere. We just didn't know what flavor of special." Martha refilled Caroline's cup. "But I'm glad people are seeing what we always knew. You've got something valuable to offer, and it's good that you're sharing it." After Martha moved on to tend to other customers, Caroline sat with her coffee and thought about the past few weeks. She'd been so afraid that stepping back into her old life would mean losing the peace she'd found in Oakmere. But it turned out that wasn't true. She was still the same person, still had the same relationships, still lived in the same cottage. She'd just added new dimensions to her life rather than replacing the old ones. Her phone buzzed. A text from Commander Hayes. "Question for you. We're dealing with a situation off the coast of Oregon. Commercial fishing vessel sank in rough weather, 3 survivors in the water. Our rescue divers are having trouble with the conditions. Do you have time for a call?" Caroline's heart rate picked up. This was real, immediate, potentially life or death. She typed back, "Call me now." The call lasted 45 minutes. Hayes patched her through to the rescue coordinator, and Caroline walked them through strategies for diving in rough seas, managing air consumption under stress, and executing rescues in poor visibility. She drew on experience from her submarine days, knowledge of how to work in hostile underwater environments, how to stay calm when everything was going wrong, how to calculate odds and make the best possible decisions with incomplete information. When the call ended, Hayes said, "You just saved us about 2 hours of trial and error. We're implementing your suggestions now. Thank you." Caroline sat back in the booth, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. This was what using her expertise felt like in real time. Not in some abstract future scenario, but right now, with lives on the line. It was terrifying. It was also incredibly meaningful. 2 hours later, Hayes texted again. "All 3 survivors recovered safely. Your input made the difference. Thank you." Caroline read the message 3 times, letting it sink in. 3 people were alive, at least in part, because she'd answered her phone and shared what she knew. That was the opposite of failure. That was exactly what she'd always wanted to do with her knowledge. Make a difference, save lives, matter. She walked home through the quiet streets of Oakmere, thinking about second chances and redemption. For 25 years, she'd believed that her failure on the Argonaut project defined her, that the 7 people who died were an insurmountable debt. But maybe she'd been looking at it wrong. Maybe those 7 deaths weren't a debt to be paid off through self-imposed exile, but a responsibility to do better, to use what she'd learned from that tragedy to prevent other tragedies. She couldn't bring Sarah and the others back, but she could honor their memory by making sure their deaths taught her something valuable about safety, about vigilance, about the importance of rigorous testing and preparation. And she could use those lessons to save others. The thought was liberating. For the first time in 25 years, Caroline felt like she could breathe fully, without the constant weight of guilt crushing her chest. She'd made her peace with the past, not by forgetting it or running from it, but by integrating it into a larger story of purpose and contribution. The next few weeks continued in the same vein. Caroline taught her classes at Seabreeze, consulted with the Coast Guard on several cases, worked on her MIT presentation, and accepted a few carefully chosen interview requests. She learned to balance her need for privacy with the public platform she'd acquired, sharing her expertise generously while maintaining boundaries around her personal life. She also reconnected with a few old colleagues from her submarine engineering days. Word had spread through the marine technology community that Dr. Caroline Reed was back, and several people reached out to express their surprise and delight. Some conversations were awkward. Explaining where she'd been for 25 years required carefully navigating painful territory. But others were wonderful, renewing friendships she'd thought were lost forever. One evening, she received an email from someone she hadn't expected to hear from, James Chen, who'd been the project manager on the Argonaut. He was retired now, living in San Diego, and he'd seen the news about the Catherine rescue. Caroline, his email read, I can't tell you how happy I am to see you doing well. After the accident, you disappeared so completely that some of us worried you might not have survived at all. I know the guilt ate at you. It ate at all of us. But I hope you found peace with what happened. The failure wasn't our fault, and the official investigation cleared everyone on the design team. More importantly, the lessons we learned from that tragedy led to safety improvements that have saved countless lives in subsequent projects. That's your legacy. Not the failure, but what came after. I'd love to reconnect if you're open to it. James. Caroline read the email several times, tears streaming down her face. She'd never considered that her colleagues might have been worried about her, might have wanted to stay in touch. She'd been so consumed by her own grief and guilt that she hadn't thought about their feelings at all. She wrote back immediately, James, thank you for reaching out. You're right that I let guilt consume me for too long. But I'm finally starting to see past it, to understand that I can't change what happened, but I can change what I do going forward. I'd very much like to reconnect. Let's set up a call soon. Caroline. The MIT symposium arrived faster than Caroline expected. She flew to Boston, her first time on a plane in years, and spent the night before her presentation at a hotel near campus. She was nervous in a way she hadn't been nervous in decades, the kind of nervous that came from truly caring about the outcome. The morning of her presentation, she dressed carefully in professional clothes she'd bought for the occasion and made her way to campus. MIT looked different than she remembered. New buildings had been added, the student population was more diverse, but the essential character of the place remained. It was still a haven for people who loved solving hard problems, who believed that rigorous thinking and innovative engineering could make the world better. The symposium was held in a large auditorium, about 200 people in attendance. Caroline waited backstage as Professor Torres introduced her, listing her credentials and describing the Catherine rescue. When she walked onto the stage, the audience applauded warmly. For a moment, Caroline felt paralyzed. All these people were here to hear what she had to say. What if she'd forgotten how to do this? What if her presentation was boring or outdated or simply wrong? But then she looked out at the audience and saw young faces, eager and curious, waiting to learn. She saw older engineers and academics, her peers, ready to engage with her ideas. She saw Professor Torres in the front row, smiling encouragingly. These were her people. This was her world. She'd been away for a long time, but she still belonged here. Caroline began her presentation, and within minutes, she'd fallen into the rhythm of it. She talked about submarine emergency egress systems, explaining the engineering principles with the clarity that came from deep understanding. She described the Argonaut accident honestly, including her own role and the guilt she'd carried. She talked about what she'd learned from that tragedy and how those lessons had informed her response during the Catherine rescue. The audience was completely engaged. People took notes, nodded at key points, and leaned forward when she described technical details. When she opened the floor for questions, hands shot up immediately. For 45 minutes, she fielded queries about everything from pressure hull design to psychological preparation for emergency situations. One young woman asked, Dr. Reed, do you regret leaving the field for 25 years? Do you think you could have contributed more if you'd stayed? Caroline considered the question carefully. I think regret is complicated. Yes, I wish I hadn't let grief and guilt sideline me for so long. But those years in Oakmere taught me things I wouldn't have learned otherwise. Patience, humility, the importance of basics and fundamentals. I became a better teacher, which has made me a better engineer now that I'm back. So while I wish I'd found a healthier way to process the trauma, I don't think those years were wasted. They were just a different kind of education. The audience applauded, and Caroline felt a surge of emotion. She'd done it. She'd stood in front of her peers and talked about the hardest parts of her life and her work. And they'd listened. More than that, they'd valued what she had to say. After the presentation, people lined up to talk with her. Young engineers wanted advice on career paths. Professors wanted to discuss collaboration opportunities. Former colleagues wanted to catch up. Caroline spent 2 hours in conversations. And while it was exhausting, it was also exhilarating. Professor Torres pulled her aside before she left. "That was exceptional, Dr. Reed. You've lost none of your brilliance. If anything, you're even better now because you've gained perspective. Would you consider teaching a course here? Maybe a semester-long seminar on underwater emergency systems?" I don't know. I still live in Oakmere. I have my work at the dive shop. It could be a once-a-week course, or even online. Think about it. We'd be lucky to have you. Caroline flew back to Oregon in a daze. Teaching at MIT. It was almost too much to process. A month ago, she'd been nobody special. Now she had job offers from prestigious institutions, speaking invitations from around the world, and recognition from the top people in her field. It should have felt overwhelming, but instead, it felt right. Like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. Like coming home to a version of herself she'd thought was dead, but had just been waiting patiently to be rediscovered. The Oceanic Society Gala was held in a historic hotel in San Francisco, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble. Caroline arrived wearing her navy dress, feeling absurdly out of place among the tuxedos and designer gowns. But Jenny had insisted on coming with her for moral support, and having her young friend beside her made everything more bearable. "You look amazing," Jenny whispered as they entered the ballroom, "like a movie star scientist." "I look old and uncomfortable." "You look distinguished and confident. There's a difference." The evening proceeded through cocktail hour, dinner, and various award presentations. Caroline sat at a table with other honorees and tried to make small talk while her stomach churned with nerves. Finally, they reached her award. A video played on a large screen, footage of the Catherine rescue, interviews with the people she'd saved, commentary from diving experts about the significance of what she'd done. Then Caroline was called to the stage. She walked up with as much grace as she could muster, accepted the award, a beautiful glass sculpture of a wave, and approached the microphone. She'd prepared remarks, but standing there in front of hundreds of people, she realized she wanted to say something different, something true. "Thank you for this honor," she began. 25 years ago, I walked away from submarine engineering after a tragic accident. 7 people died on a submarine I'd helped design, and I believed that my career, my whole identity as an engineer, died with them. I spent decades teaching diving in a small town, convinced that I was done with the work I'd trained for, that I'd lost the right to call myself an engineer. But then the Catherine incident happened, and I discovered that you can't actually kill off parts of yourself. They go underground, maybe, but they don't disappear. And when the moment came that required every bit of knowledge and training I possessed, everything I'd tried to leave behind came flooding back. This award isn't just for rescuing 6 people from a collapsed wreck. It's for the reminder that our skills, our expertise, our hard-won knowledge, these things matter. They can save lives. And hiding them, whether from fear or grief or guilt, doesn't serve anyone. I want to thank the people of Oakmere for giving me a place to heal. I want to thank my colleagues in the marine engineering community for welcoming me back. Most of all, I want to thank the 6 people I pulled out of that wreck, because saving them saved me too. They reminded me who I really am, and they gave me permission to be that person again. To any young engineers out there, learn as much as you can, push boundaries, take smart risks, but also know that failure is part of the process. When things go wrong, and they will, you have a choice. You can let failure define you, or you can let it teach you. I chose the first path for too long. I'm finally choosing the second path now. Thank you. The applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet. Caroline stood there clutching her award, feeling tears stream down her face. She'd been so afraid to be vulnerable, to admit her failures and fears in public. But the response wasn't judgment or criticism, it was understanding and empathy. Back at her table, Jenny hugged her tightly. That was beautiful and totally true. I'm so proud of you. The rest of the evening was a blur of congratulations and conversation. Multiple people approached Caroline about potential projects, consulting work, or research collaborations. She collected business cards and made vague promises to follow up, still too emotionally raw to make concrete commitments. But one conversation stood out. A woman in her 60s approached Caroline during the after-party, introducing herself as Dr. Patricia Williams, director of the Ocean Safety Institute. "I've been following your story," she said, "and I'd like to talk to you about starting a new program focused on diving emergency response training. We'd want you to design the curriculum and lead the instruction. It would be based wherever you want, even Oakmere, if that's where you're most comfortable. Would you be interested?" That's a big undertaking. It is. But from what I've seen, you're uniquely qualified to do it. And there's a real need. Diving is getting more popular every year, but safety training hasn't kept pace. We need people like you, experts who can bridge the gap between academic knowledge and practical application. Caroline took Dr. Williams's card and promised to think about it. Another opportunity, another chance to do something meaningful with her expertise. The possibilities were almost overwhelming. She and Jenny flew back to Oregon the next day. On the plane, Caroline stared out the window at the clouds below and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 2 months. She'd gone from anonymous dive instructor to recognized expert. She'd reconnected with her past while building a new future. She'd accepted awards and given speeches and consulted on emergencies. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. "What are you thinking about?" Jenny asked. "Everything. Nothing. I don't even know." Caroline turned to her friend. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing? Saying yes to all these opportunities? Do you want to say yes?" "Part of me does. The part that remembers how good it felt to solve hard problems, to use my brain at full capacity, to make a real difference. But another part of me wants to hide in Oakmere and pretend none of this ever happened." Jenny considered this. "Can I tell you what I see? I see someone who's been given a second chance at the career she loved, and she's terrified of messing it up again. But Caroline, you're not the same person who worked on the Argonaut. You're older, wiser, more careful. You've seen what can go wrong, and you'll be more vigilant because of it. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you better. You're very wise for 28. I learned from the best." Jenny squeezed her hand. "Whatever you decide, I support you, but don't let fear make your decisions. Let purpose make them." They landed in Portland and drove back to Oakmere through the coastal mountains. By the time they reached the town, night had fallen, and the lights of the harbor twinkled like earthbound stars. Caroline felt the familiar sense of coming home, but now it was layered with something new. A sense of possibility, of doors opening rather than closing. Over the next week, Caroline tried to return to her normal routine. She taught her classes at Seabreeze, went for her morning walks on the beach, had coffee at Martha's Cafe. But everything felt different now. People treated her with a mix of pride and deference that was uncomfortable. Tourists specifically requested her as their instructor. Local news crews asked to interview her about marine safety. Marcus found her one afternoon sitting on the dock, staring out at the ocean. "You look troubled." "I'm trying to figure out what my life is supposed to be now." He sat beside her. "What do you mean?" "I thought I'd figured it out, you know. Small town, simple job, quiet life. But now everything's complicated again. I have all these opportunities, all these people wanting things from me, and I don't know if I should embrace that or run from it." "What does your gut tell you?" Caroline thought about it. "My gut tells me that hiding was never really the answer. It was just what I needed at the time. But maybe I don't need it anymore. Maybe it's time to stop hiding." "Then there's your answer. But what about Oakmere? What about this place that gave me refuge for 25 years? Marcus smiled. "Caroline, Oakmere isn't going anywhere. This town will always be here for you, always be home. But that doesn't mean you have to be here every single day. You can be based here and still do work in the wider world. You can teach diving and also consult with the Coast Guard. You can be the local hero and also the renowned expert. Those things don't contradict each other." It seemed so obvious when he said it that way. Caroline had been thinking in terms of either or. Either stay in Oakmere or return to her old life. Either be the simple dive instructor or the sophisticated engineer. But maybe the truth was both and. Maybe she could integrate all the different parts of herself into one cohesive whole. That evening, Caroline made a series of decisions. She called Dr. Williams at the Ocean Safety Institute and said yes to designing their new diving emergency response program. She called Professor Torres at MIT and agreed to teach one online course per semester. She confirmed her ongoing consulting arrangement with the Coast Guard. And she told Marcus that she'd like to reduce her hours at Seabreeze to part-time so she'd have bandwidth for these other projects. "That sounds perfect," Marcus said. "You'll still be here enough to teach our core classes, but you'll have flexibility for the other work. And honestly, having a world-renowned expert on staff is great for business." The weeks that followed were among the busiest of Caroline's life. She worked on curriculum design for the Ocean Safety Institute, prepared her first MIT lecture, consulted on 3 Coast Guard cases, and still managed to teach diving twice a week. She was exhausted, but it was the good kind of exhaustion that came from being fully engaged with meaningful work. One day, she received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photograph, a group shot from the symposium at MIT, showing Caroline surrounded by students and colleagues, everyone smiling. There was a note from Professor Torres. "Welcome home to the marine engineering community. We missed you." Caroline put the photograph on her bookshelf, next to pictures of Oakmere and her diving students. It was a visual representation of her new integrated life. Engineer and teacher, expert and friend, someone who belonged to both worlds. She also started having regular video calls with James Chen and other former colleagues from her submarine days. They'd formed an informal group they called the Old Engineers Society, where they discussed current projects, shared war stories, and caught each other up on the past 25 years. These calls were healing in ways Caroline hadn't expected, allowing her to reconnect with a community she'd thought she'd lost forever. 3 months after the Catherine rescue, Caroline stood on the same pier where she'd watched the sunrise the morning of the fateful dive. So much had changed since then, but the ocean was the same, eternal, powerful, full of mystery and danger and beauty. Her phone buzzed. Commander Hayes. Question about underwater structural assessment. Got time for a call? Caroline smiled and typed back, always. She'd found her purpose again, the reason all that training and expertise existed, not to design the perfect submarine or solve the impossible problem, but to use what she knew to help others, to keep people safe, to pass on knowledge that might save a life someday. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Caroline watched the fishing boats come home, the tourists taking final photographs, the town settling into evening. This was her place, her refuge, her foundation. But it was no longer her hiding place. She'd stepped back into the world, and the world had welcomed her home. She thought about Sarah, her friend who died on the Argonaut. What would Sarah think of her now? Caroline wanted to believe she'd be proud. She'd be glad that Caroline had finally stopped running from the grief and guilt, that she'd learned to channel her expertise into something positive. Carolyn would never forget the 7 people who died. But she'd finally learned to live with that loss rather than be defined by it. She'd learned that failure didn't disqualify you from future success, that making mistakes didn't mean you had nothing to offer. Most importantly, she'd learned that you could walk away from your life and still find your way back, even after 25 years. Her phone rang again. Jenny, calling from home. "Hey, are you still at the dock? A bunch of us are getting together at Martha's for dinner. You should come." "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Caroline took one last look at the ocean, feeling the salt breeze on her face. Then she turned and walked back toward town, toward her friends and her community and her multifaceted life. She was Dr. Caroline Reed again, but she was also Caroline the dive instructor, Caroline the neighbor, Caroline the friend. All of those identities existed simultaneously, each one enriching the others. Behind her, the ocean whispered its eternal song, dangerous and life-giving, unforgiving and generous, always there, always changing, always teaching those who had the courage to dive deep. 1 year later, Caroline stood on a boat offshore from Oakmere, supervising a training exercise for the new diving emergency response program. 12 students, a mix of Coast Guard personnel, commercial divers, and rescue specialists, were practicing underwater structural assessment in a controlled environment. She watched them work, occasionally calling out corrections or encouragement through the underwater communication system. They were good students, taking her lessons seriously, applying the principles she'd taught them. In a few weeks, they'd graduate and go on to work in various capacities, carrying her knowledge with them. Jenny surfaced and swam over to the boat. She was one of the assistant instructors now, having completed an intensive training program that Caroline had designed. "They're doing great," she reported. "Everyone's following protocol, no one's panicking, buoyancy control is solid. Good. Let's do one more round of the debris clearing exercise, and then we'll call it a day." As the exercise continued, Caroline's mind wandered to the past year. It had been intense, challenging, and ultimately rewarding. She'd taught courses at MIT, consulted on numerous Coast Guard cases, published several papers on dive safety, and seen her emergency response program expand to include locations in 5 different states. But she'd also maintained her connection to Oakmere. She still lived in her cottage on Seashell Lane. She still had coffee at Martha's Cafe most mornings. She still taught open water certification classes at Seabreeze twice a month. The town remained her home base, the place where she was just Caroline, not Dr. Reed the expert. The balance wasn't always easy. Some weeks she felt stretched too thin, pulled in too many directions. But most of the time, she felt grateful for the opportunity to do meaningful work, to use her expertise in ways that mattered. The exercise ended successfully, and Carolyn gathered her students on the boat for a debrief. She walked them through what they'd done well and what they could improve, emphasizing always the importance of preparation, communication, and staying calm under pressure. "Remember," she told them, "in an emergency, people will look to you for leadership. You need to be the calm center in the chaos, That doesn't mean you won't be afraid. Fear is natural and appropriate in dangerous situations. But you can't let fear control your actions. You act based on training, procedure, and careful assessment. That's what keeps people alive. After the students left, Marcus helped her clean up the boat and secure the equipment. "Another good class," he said. "You've really built something special with this program. It's satisfying work. Knowing that I'm training people who might save lives someday, it feels like I'm finally doing what I was always meant to do. What you were always meant to do was help people. You've been doing that here in Oakmere for 25 years. This is just a bigger platform for the same mission." They motored back to the harbor as the sun began to set. Caroline looked at the familiar coastline, the rocky cliffs, the whitewashed buildings, the lighthouse on the northern point. This view never got old. No matter how much she traveled or how many speeches she gave or how many programs she ran, coming home to Oakmere always felt like exhaling. That evening, there was a town meeting at the community center. The topic was whether to establish stricter regulations for diving the local wrecks in light of the Catherine incident. Caroline had been asked to present expert testimony. The community center was packed. Carolyn saw familiar faces: Tom, the harbor master, Martha from the cafe, Frank, the retired cop, the college students she'd saved, now graduated and working various jobs, and dozens of others. She felt a wave of affection for these people who'd given her a home when she'd needed one most. The mayor called the meeting to order and invited Caroline to speak. She approached the microphone, organized her notes, and began. "Thank you all for coming. As most of you know, I've spent the past year studying diving accidents and developing safety protocols. Based on that research and my experience with the Catherine incident, I have some recommendations for how we can make diving in Oakmere safer without destroying the tourism industry that many of you depend on." For 30 minutes, she outlined a comprehensive plan: better training requirements for dive guides, regular structural assessments of popular wreck sites, improved emergency response protocols, and a rating system that would clearly indicate the difficulty and risk level of different dive locations. The plan was pragmatic and achievable, balancing safety concerns with economic realities. When she finished, the mayor opened the floor for questions. There were the usual concerns about costs and implementation, but overall, people seemed receptive. Frank stood up and said, "I think Dr. Reed has done her homework here. These recommendations make sense, and they'll save lives. I move that we adopt them." The motion was seconded and passed with only 2 dissenting votes. Caroline felt a swell of pride. This was local impact, the kind of change that would directly benefit her community. After the meeting, people lingered to chat. Caroline found herself surrounded by well-wishers and people wanting to discuss the new regulations. She answered questions patiently, explained technical details when needed, and accepted congratulations gracefully. Finally, the crowd thinned, and Caroline was able to walk home. It was a clear night, stars brilliant overhead, the sound of waves a constant backdrop. She let herself into her cottage, made a cup of tea, and settled onto her back porch. Her laptop sat on the table, and she opened it to check her email. There was a message from Dr. Williams at the Ocean Safety Institute, asking if Caroline would be interested in speaking at an international conference on maritime safety in Stockholm next spring. There was a follow-up from one of her MIT students, asking for a recommendation letter. There was an inquiry from a documentary filmmaker about consulting on a project about submarine disasters. All of these were good opportunities, things that a year ago she wouldn't have imagined being possible. But she'd learned to be selective, to choose the projects that aligned with her goals and values, rather than saying yes to everything. She replied to Dr. Williams, yes to Stockholm. She'd always wanted to visit Sweden. She made a note to write the recommendation letter tomorrow. and she politely declined the documentary. She'd done enough looking backward at submarine disasters. She preferred to focus on preventing future ones. Caroline closed her laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to the ocean. A year ago, she'd been terrified of being pulled back into her old life. Now she'd created a new life that honored both her past and her present. She was Dr. Caroline Reed, submarine engineer and dive instructor, expert and teacher, someone who'd failed catastrophically and learned to try again. The path forward was clear now. She'd continue building her emergency response program, training people to handle underwater crises. She'd keep consulting with the Coast Guard, lending her expertise where it was needed. She'd maintain her teaching at MIT and continue publishing research that advanced the field of dive safety. And she'd stay rooted in Oakmere, this small town that had been her refuge and was now her launching pad. She thought about the Argonaut one last time, not with the crushing guilt that had haunted her for so many years, but with a bittersweet acceptance. 7 people had died, and she would always wish she could have prevented that. But she'd learned that you honored the dead not by stopping all activity for fear of future failure, but by using what their deaths taught you to save others. Sarah would have understood that. Sarah would have told her to stop hiding and get back to work. Sarah would have been proud of what she'd accomplished this past year. Caroline raised her tea mug in a silent toast to her old friend, to the 7 who'd died, to the 6 she'd saved, and to all the people she might save in the future through her teaching and her advocacy and her stubborn insistence that safety mattered more than convenience. The ocean continued its eternal rhythm, waves breaking and reforming, tides flowing in and out. Caroline sat with it, part of it, at peace with herself and her place in the world. She'd come to Oakmere 26 years ago, broken and afraid, running from responsibility and expertise and the possibility of failure. She'd stayed for 25 years, healing slowly, building a quiet life, teaching people to love the ocean the way she did. And then one day, the ocean had tested her again. It had trapped 6 people in a collapsing wreck and asked if she remembered who she really was. She'd answered that test by being fully herself, every skill, every bit of knowledge, every ounce of courage and determination. Now she was ready for whatever came next, ready to be both Dr. Reed and Caroline, to inhabit multiple worlds simultaneously, to use her gifts without apologizing for them, ready to teach and learn, to lead and follow, to remember the past without being trapped by it. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, its steady pulse a reminder that even in darkness, there were guides to help you find your way home. Caroline watched it for a while longer, then stood, stretched, and went inside. Tomorrow, she'd wake early and walk the beach. She'd have coffee at Martha's and chat with her neighbors. She'd answer emails and work on curriculum design, and maybe do a certification dive with a nervous student. She'd live her complicated, multifaceted, purposeful life, making the most of the second chance she'd been given. The past year had taught her that it was never too late to reclaim the parts of yourself you thought were lost. It was never too late to try again, to risk failure in pursuit of something meaningful, to believe that your knowledge and expertise mattered. She'd been a submarine engineer who became a dive instructor, who became a submarine engineer again, but this time wiser and more grounded. She'd been a woman destroyed by grief, who learned to live with loss and eventually transform it into purpose. She'd been someone hiding from the world, who learned that the world needed what she had to offer, and she was just getting started. Caroline turned off the lights and went to bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference. The ocean would still be there, eternal and unforgiving. And she would still be there too, doing the work she was meant to do, living the life she was meant to live. At 67, she'd finally come home to herself, and it felt exactly right. If this story touched you, Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.